Hello, and welcome back to Kim's Cozy Corner. I'm Kim, and today we're going to talk about home preserving. What is it all about? How do we do it? There are many different ways, and we're going to talk through some of those. Come with me and let's get started. When you have a garden, you have to do one of two things with the things that you grow. Either you're going to eat it, or you're going to have to find a way to put it up and store it for short term or either long term. And for those of us who want to grow a year's supply of vegetables versus having to go to the store, we have to really understand the safe ways of preserving our food. Of course, you want to pick your vegetables at the peak of ripeness, right? So when it's perfectly red and ripe and is just right to the touch. I mean, like, look at these pictures of these tomatoes. They weren't picked early. They weren't picked green and traveled across the country green for it to turn red or orange, 4 weeks later. I didn't pick them out the garden until they were ready to be harvested. And now I'm ready to eat it, right? And if you grow as many plants as I do, there's no way you're going to eat it all when the harvest comes in, no matter how much you stagger your plantings. Some things are just going to start coming in faster than you can consume them. Once you get to that stage, you're going to have to determine how you're going to preserve it. Are you going to freeze it? Are you going to can it? Are you going to dehydrate it? Like, you have to determine the best ways to preserve your harvest. And one of the best things or tools that I found early on as I started saving my food and preserving my food was this book right here. They used to call it the Ball Blue Book or the Big Blue Book. But Ball is a company that has done tons and tons of studies and research and tests to determine the safe ways of preserving your food. So I still use this book. And so if I want to preserve green beans, there's a recipe in here and they'll tell me how to do it safely. If I want to preserve pickles, there's a recipe in here to tell me how to do that as well. And there are recipes in here that talk about doing water bath canning as well as pressure canning. And then there's always fermenting and dehydrating. So there are many, many different ways to preserve your food. I'm going to briefly talk through the ones that I like to use, and I don't use all of them. And if you recall, or if you've seen any of my other videos, I work full-time, and 50% of that is travel. So I travel all over the country, so I'm not always home. So being able to do preserving quickly and efficiently is very important to me, since I don't really have that much time at home to do these type things. When you're thinking about preserving and storing your food, you have to determine if you want short-term storage or long-term storage. For long-term storage, I think of freeze drying and vacuum sealing your harvest so that it lasts like 20, 25 years. That's not the business that I'm in. I want to eat my food in the next year or two. So I'm not talking long-term storage. That's not what I'm talking. I'm talking short-term storage. And short-term is 1 or 2 years, maybe 3. I have had things last up to 5, but I'm talking a very short window in comparison to 25 years. The methods that I use consist of 3 different ways. Canning. And there's a couple methods I use for canning, dehydrating, and freezing. Let's start with freezing first. Freezing, like, literally take your harvest, throw it in a freezer bag, and throw it in your freezer, and you're good to go. And you're going to get a couple of months storage if that's all you do. Just like a typical Ziploc freezer bag, throw it in your freezer. But if you want to extend that a little bit more, get yourself a vacuum sealer. I have a vacuum sealer, and I use it for vegetables and cheese and meats and all kinds of other things. But by sucking out all of that extra oxygen, it allows for a longer storage in your freezer. If I'm looking for, a month, 2 month storage in the freezer, don't worry about vacuum sealing. I just throw it in a Ziploc bag. But freezing is the first option. It's the easiest option, requires the least amount of work, and you just put it away and you're good to go. For vacuum sealing, here's a picture of the unit that I have. It's a very simple unit. It'll vacuum seal moist items like meats, as well as dry items. That's it for freezing. It's the simplest option. A lot of times I will throw my tomatoes in the freezer if I don't have time to process them, and leave them in the freezer until I'm ready to deal with them. So the freezer is a great short-term option as you're finding time for that longer-term storage of canning or other means of storage. So don't count your freezer out. The second type that I want to talk about is dehydration, or dehydrating your harvest. I typically do this with all of my herbs, with all of my basil and cilantro and parsley and sage and oregano and rosemary and all of those things. I like to use a freeze dryer. Here's a picture of the freeze dryer that I like. I did a lot of research trying to decide which one I would prefer to purchase, and with all of the research, this one gives me 9 trays to work with at any one given time. It actually has a fan in the back, so it actually circulates the air around the items that I'm trying to dehydrate. So I feel like it works faster. So I actually was gifted one that I used a couple of times, and I really didn't like it. The trays were sitting on top of each other. The fan was underneath. It took forever. I never could get it to really dry. So that one wasn't for me, but it's where I started. And so, of course, I gifted that to the next person when I purchased my Excalibur, which is in the picture here. Excalibur comes in many different sizes as well. They have some with many different types of programming. I didn't need an automatic timer on mine. I just set it, and then I use my personal timers to understand where I am and check on it and things of that nature. But I thought it was important to get the 9 tray so that I could preserve as much as possible at the same time, so I didn't have to run it as much, right? It's all about being more efficient in your harvest and your preserving. So I got the 9 tray. I don't think I've ever used it with all 9 trays at any one given time. I think the most I've ever used is about 6, but I want to have that option as my harvests continue to get bigger and bigger every year. My dehydrator will do some other things as well. Like, you can make yogurt in my dehydrator. I've never tried it, but there's a setting for it as well. You can make jerky. You can make, some people call them like fruit roll-ups or fruit leathers, things of that nature. My family doesn't really eat those, but if we did, this would be an option where I could preserve my fruit as well. I have yet to dehydrate any fruit, but I plan to do that this upcoming year. I tried bananas. My kids didn't like those, and I tried strawberries. They didn't really like the strawberries either. You can dehydrate your small grape tomatoes. You can dehydrate so many different things, onion, garlic, all kinds of stuff. And I plan to do some dehydrating of peppers to make paprika powder. I want to make some garlic powder this year, as well as onion powder this year. So I got to have a large harvest to do that, right? But my dehydrator is going to get a lot of work this year. But let's talk about the main type of preserving for me. I did a video on my pantry and my storage of most of my canned preserves and canned vegetables. And so I just recently released that. So take a look at that video and you'll get to see some of the things that I can as I'm preserving that year's supply of vegetables. But for the canning, there's like 3 different things that I like to think about canning in 3 different ways. One is fermenting, which I'm gonna be honest with you, I haven't had any luck with fermenting yet, but I haven't given up. I'm gonna keep trying. That's how they used to do everything, right? They didn't put everything in vinegar, and your pickles weren't all vinegar, right? They did fermentation, where they just took some water, some salt, and they put it to the side and, fermented it. That's the traditional old-fashioned pickles and sauerkrauts and things of that nature. Here's the set that I have. And make sure that you can see it in the picture there. It's from Mason Tops. It's the complete kit. There's a book in here that teaches you how to ferment. All of the tools and the materials and everything you need is in here as well. And so I only tried twice last season to ferment. It didn't go well, but everyone says this works. So I'm going to keep trying. I am going to learn how to ferment because I want some fermented kimchi. I don't want the quick kimchi. I want fermented kimchi. So I'm going to keep trying, and I'm going to eventually get it. But I have my whole fermenting kit here, so I can continue to experiment, and I will get it. I don't give up. I will get it. Outside of fermenting, which I have not mastered, let me be clear, I have not mastered that, are the other 2, which are my primary ways of preserving, which are water bath canning and pressure canning. Let's talk about water bath canning first. Here's the type pot I use to do water bath canning. It's just a huge stock pot that basically you're going to put your jars in. You're going to cover it with water. You're going to need an inch or 2 of water above the jars. And then you cook it for however long this book right here tells you to cook it for. You boil it, right? You bring it to a boil and you boil it per the instructions in the book. And then you turn it off. You let it the temperature come down. You set it to the side. And you'll end up with a whole bunch of canned goods like these right here. That's probably the most, I probably do more water bath canning than anything else. Water bath canning are for highly acidic type foods. So your fruits are the type things that you absolutely, your jams and your jellies and your peaches and your apples and applesauce, all of those type things are highly acidic, and you can water bath can those. You don't need to get it to a very high temperature to kill off all of the bad bacteria, right? Water bath canning, with it being very acidic, does it all for you. You don't have to worry about that. Anything that you're canning in a vinegar solution typically is highly acidic as well, and you can water bath can those. If your food is not highly acidic, okay, if there's no vinegar in it, right, you just want to can some corn, right? Corn is not highly acidic. And so in order to make it safe, you need to get the pressure above, I think it's like 210, 212 degrees or something like that. Don't quote me on that part. But I know that you have to raise the temperature higher than boiling water. And you can't do that in a water bath canner. You need pressure to get the temperature high enough to kill those unwanted bacteria. Okay? So that's why there's pressure canning. For the pressure canning, there's a couple of different methods out there now. There's the traditional pressure canners where you put it on your stove or your heating element, whatever type it is. You bring the temperature up to a certain point. You bring the pot up to a point where there's steam escaping from the pot. I think it's for like 10 minutes, and then you put the weight on it, and you need a 10-pound weight or a weight depending on where you are in your elevation, because elevation will determine how quickly things will come to a boil and get that temperature to the right setting. And so you need to understand where your elevation is when it comes to pressure canning. But you will put a little weight on there, and then you'll cook it as long as the ball book tells you to cook it for. So that's one way. But with all of the technology and everything else out there today, now again, that's the safest way to pressure cook, to pressure can. That's the safest way. But with all the new technology out there now, there are electric pressure canners. And this isn't a video to go through all the different options of those, but there are electric pressure canners out there. And when I'm talking about those, I'm talking about the ones that actually say that it's safe to can your produce in, not one that you use to cook your rice in. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about true electric pressure canners. Presto has one, and there's some others out there. I'm going to leave that research up to you to determine if that's something you want to do or not. There's a lot of debate about that. That's not what this is about. I just want to let you know there are options out there. I'll let you do your own research. But if you're going to do pressure canning of your low acidic foods, then you have to determine which method you want to use. And so I do some pressure canning, and typically it's of things like my southern field peas, it's my green beans, my carrots, those type items that I don't use any type of vinegar, and it's not a fruit, then I'll use those, I'll pressure can those. So those are the three types of canning that I like to use. And of those three types of canning, there are still some tools that you're going to need regardless of which method you choose. First, you have to determine what size jars are you going to use. Are you going to use the teeny little, half pint jars? Are you going to use a pint jar, quart, half gallon, right? You need to determine what size container you want to store your food in. Now, I personally, for my family of about 6, it's a family of 5 all the time, but I have an adult daughter who comes and goes, so I like to include her in that number. She's eating here at least a couple times a week or taking food from me a couple times a week, so that's why I like to include her in my number. But for my family of 6, I usually can my tomatoes and things that I know I'm going to make a big batch, right? I'm going to put it in a huge stock pot and I'm going to make chili or a soup or something of that nature. I prefer to can in quarts or larger. But for my storage, half gallons won't fit in my cabinet space. And so I have to stay at the quart level or below. I personally like to can my materials in either quarts, pints, or pint and a half. Or if it's my jellies and jams, I like to put those in smaller containers because I don't go through a whole jar in one sitting. I will go through, just 2 or 3 teaspoons every time I use it. So I like to put my jellies and my jams and my butters in very small containers. And then my pints, I like to use for my pickles. Because again, I don't want too big of a jar. And I don't have a lot of space in my refrigerator, so I'm going to open what I need. And I want to keep it fresh as long as possible. So my pint-sized jars is a very common size for me for pickles and peppers and things of that nature. And then I usually stop at quart jars. The next important thing you're going to need are your lids for your jars. And I tell you, ever since 2020, these things are a hot commodity. If I'm not mistaken, 2020 was the year that you couldn't find a lid if you wanted one. You couldn't buy them online. They were not in the store anywhere. There was a shortage of lids. So, and I personally don't like to reuse my lids. Some people do. I prefer to put a new lid on anything that I'm preserving. Now, I will reuse a lid to store something in the refrigerator or something of that nature, or a jar that I'm using in my pantry space, but not for my fresh canned goods. So start purchasing these early. Don't wait till the harvest come in. I typically, every time I go into the grocery store in late winter, early spring, every time I go in, I'll pick up one. I'll pick up two. You know, I want to make sure that I have plenty. Ball was the only brand that I ever used until 2020, just to be honest with you. It was the only brand I would use. And they have, you know, the wide mouth lids and then the regular mouth lids, right? After 2020 and I could not get lids, I strayed off the beaten path, right? I gave some other name brands a try, and some of them worked very well. Some of those wouldn't even fit my jars properly. And so you have to be careful what lids you're purchasing. The ForJars, which is a name brand that I've come across, works wonders. I'm going to be honest with you. It works just as good as a ball lid. I have no issues whatsoever with the ForJars canning lids. And so you might want to look into those. You can buy them in large quantities. Like this is 100 canning lids in one container. And they come in many different sizes. Of course, the larger quantity you buy, the cheaper it'll be. And they're much cheaper than a ball canning lid. So something to keep in mind. So I now probably have enough canning lids to last me a couple of years because I'll never run out again. That'll never happen to me. So these are the two name brands I typically use, just to be fair. I use either the ball or I use the ForJars canning lids. So I want to make sure you see both of those. So we talked about the jars, we talked about the lids. Now, what equipment am I going to use to prep my harvest before I put it into the jar? And so if you have small batches, you know, a simple stock pot might be good enough to parboil those potatoes or the corn, or blanch those green beans, or blanch the collard greens, or you know, depending on what the ball book says you need to do. And so what are you going to use to get your harvest into the condition it needs to be in before you put it in the jar? So a nice stock pot is always a good thing. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have a really big stock pot. I mean, I have like, I think it's a 6 quart. It's really not big. And so when I'm processing tomatoes, you know, I have over 100 tomato plants out there. And so when the harvests come in, a 6 quart stock pot's not going to do. So I've gone to the roaster oven. And so here's a picture of my roaster oven. They come in many different sizes and shapes and things of that nature. And now I borrow my sister's as well, so I can have 2 roaster ovens going at the same time. But I mentioned putting those tomatoes in the freezer. So as I start harvesting tomatoes, I don't want to have to process a small batch. So I throw them all in my freezer until I know I have at least 1 roaster oven of tomatoes. If I have at least 1 roaster oven, I will take all of those frozen tomatoes, and if you let them thaw out, the skins will come off super easy. So you don't have to worry about blanching them to get the skins off and things of that nature. But the skins will come off easy. Throw them in that roasting oven, and I just let them cook down right there in the roaster oven. And they will slowly cook down. You can work on them over multiple days if you need to. And then you can cook them down to whatever it is you're going to make. You know, a spaghetti sauce. Then you take part of the batch out to make your spaghetti sauce. If you're making pizza sauce, take part of it out and put that into the stock pot and get it down to the right, I don't want to say seasoning, but you can put the like the peppers and the garlic and the bell peppers, garlic and onion and that kind of stuff in there in smaller batches. But your big bulk batch is just tomatoes cooking down. So the roaster oven is very important to me. And then you need to determine, you know, how smooth do you want? Are you making a tomato sauce? Are you making a tomato paste? Right? You'll cook it down to whatever you need it to be, but maybe you need it to be blended. So a lot of times people will use a stick blender to get it blended to the right consistency that you need. So especially if you're making like applesauce, you can cook the apples down, but if you want to blend it to that really smooth, silky consistency, or maybe you have a small baby and you want to make applesauce for like baby food, and that's really, really smooth. I like to use a Vitamix. And so here's my Vitamix right here. I'm sure you've heard of a Vitamix by now, but it's a real fancy, heavy duty blender. If you've ever gotten a shake from any ice cream shop, most likely they had a version of a Vitamix. Ninja, there's some other brands out there, but they all do the same thing. So I use a Vitamix. I don't use a stick blender. I have in the past, but I don't use it anymore. I use my Vitamix for everything, for my salsas, for my applesauce, for my jellies, my jams. Depending on what texture I want, the Vitamix will give me that texture. I use my Vitamix to grind up my dehydrated herbs to get it to the consistency and the size that I want it as well. So the Vitamix is super handy and flexible to get to to the consistency you're looking for. I think that's it. I don't think I missed anything other than the tools to lift your jars in and out of your water bath canners and your pressure cookers and that kind of stuff. You want to make sure that you have something so you can safely pull those hot jars out of those devices. So, you want to be safe. Keep yourself safe. We don't want you to get burned. There are tools to help you do that. There will be tools to make sure you're getting your air pockets and that kind of stuff out of your jars as well while you're cooking. And typically, you can buy all of that as a set. And usually they're right there on your canning and preserving aisle in your grocery store, Amazon. Everybody has them. All of those type things. You can even get this ball book right here. A much smaller version, right? Of course, I had to go all in and get the big heavy duty option with over, I think it's 400 recipes in this book, but they have smaller options out there. Those are all the tools that you'll need for preserving your harvest. When it becomes harvest season, I will have more videos showing you the steps that I take to preserve my food. If you enjoyed this video, please, 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 please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a wonderful, safe day. Enjoy growing. Bye-bye.